The first thing I want to do is apologise for the title of this video. In a perfect world, it would be called Video Games with Unusual Inspirations, but this is YouTube, where the algorithm basically demands everything has to have an element of drama, so we're stuck with huge games that stole ideas. Don't blame me, blame Neil Moham. He can't even spell his own name correctly, let alone sort out YouTube, the knob. The first game with an unusual inspiration is Super Mario Bros. On the Famicom/NES. I'm not going to waste everyone's time and introduce the game, because if you're watching this, you're probably not a complete mon. Anyway, after it was released on the Famicom in 1985, players and journalists started drawing parallels between Super Mario Bros. And Namco's Pac-Land, released a year before in 1984. Toru Iwatani, who created Pac-Man in 1980, yes, Pac-Man, it was renamed to Pac-Man when released outside of Japan because it was feared that Western children would graffiti the cabinets to say "fuck man." I definitely would have done that. After Pac-Man, Toru Iwatani made a follow-up game called Super Pac-Man in 1982, and in 1984 he directed Pac-Land. Now, Pac-Land wasn't the first side-scrolling platform game. We already had games like Jump Bug and Son Son, but it was the first game to feature a scrolling background that moved along as the player progressed through the stage. Then Super Mario Bros. Did the same thing the year after Pac-Land. An outlet called Geek Culture did an interview with Toru Iwatani, and he said that Shigeru Miyamoto told him that Super Mario Bros. Was influenced by Pac-Land. Also in the book The Untold History of Japanese Game Developers Volume 2, Yoshihiro Kishimoto, who also works at Namco, says he heard the same story about Shigeru Miyamoto saying that Pac-Land inspired the creation of Super Mario Bros.
But wait, there's more!
I don't think that inspiration actually ends with just the concept of side-scrolling backgrounds. In Super Mario Bros., you have to make a tricky jump at the end of each stage to hit the top of the flagpole in order to earn the highest amount of bonus points. Pac-Land actually has a very similar feature. At the very end of the stage, the game freezes the action and awards the player an amount of points depending on how close to the floor you are. You get more bonus points the closer to the ground, but 0 points if you're touching it. And in case you were wondering, the perfect place to jump to get the top bonus is when Pac-Man is directly under this line. So this wall of the upper section of the house, when you're in line with that, hit the jump there and you'll get the maximum bonus points of 7,650. Something else to note about Super Mario Bros. And Pac-Man, both official follow-up games have the word Super at the start. Toru Iwatani made Pac-Man, and then 2 years later, the next Pac-Man game he made was Super Pac-Man in 1982. No one remembers this game, and rightly so. Look at it, it's a complete mess of crap. There was Ms. Pac-Man in between those games, but that was a hack made by some Americans that ended up getting an official release. Toru Iwatani had nothing to do with that, so I'm just going to gloss over it. Shigeru Miyamoto made the first Mario Bros. Game in 1983. The next game was Super Mario Bros. In 1985. Did he use Super in the title because of Super Pac-Man? I think so, yes, but I don't think it's an observation many people have made. In fact, the only other person I've heard mention this idea is Tim Rogers. While we were talking about things Super Mario's copied, it's nothing to do with Pac-Land, but I just want to put it in there. The underground theme song. That is a complete rip-off of a 1979 jazz record. Koji Kondo, you've been busted, mate. Let's move away from Mario and get into something a bit more family-friendly, a bit more wholesome. Grand Theft Auto. Now, everyone liked Grand Theft Auto, well, everyone apart from Elon Musk, who couldn't bring himself to commit pretend crime in a video game.
What a bitch.
What the fuck is that about? Imagine if you offered to lend a friend a copy of Yakuza, but he turned it down because he couldn't bring himself to beat up random dudes. You'd never stop taking the piss out of him over how much of a pussy he was being. But anyway, Rockstar Games, who make Grand Theft Auto, like all the best people, originate from the UK and grew up playing home microcomputers like the ZX Spectrum and Commodore 64. You can even see this influence in the intro to GTA's Vice City on the PlayStation. What is also known is that these guys used to play a ZX Spectrum game called Turbo Esprit and cite it as a direct influence for the GTA series. If you were to play Turbo Esprit today, you probably wouldn't think much of it. I don't think much of it, and I had a ZX Spectrum back in the late 80s. Decades of improvements in video games has rendered Turbo Esprit almost unplayable today. Hell, decades of improvements in video games have rendered most ZX Spectrum games unplayable today. Even games I used to enjoy as a kid are simply absolute dog now. Rose-tinted sunglasses for idiots who can't let go of the past. In a world where I can play Outrun or MAME anytime I like, I'm never ever going to choose to play the ZX Spectrum version ever again because it is utter shit. And Turbo Esprit is utter shit too. From a technical perspective, this is some brilliant programming to have this open world driving game running on the ZX Spectrum, and you can absolutely see the DNA of Grand Theft Auto on show here. The large map, running people over, shooting at other cars, mission points on the map, chasing other cars around, it's all in there, but I wouldn't actually advise trying to play it because it's utter jank. But what you should play, and I hope you have, because if not, shame on you, is Street Fighter. Now, there's a lot of Street Fighter games. Hell, there's a lot of games just called Street Fighter 2. But out of all the Super Hyper Turbo Alpha Championship Zero fucking John editions, the best one is Street Fighter Zero 2 Alpha in the arcade. I'm not going to go into why, that's not the point of the video, but it is the best Street Fighter game. Anyway, the point is, we all know what Street Fighter is because of Street Fighter 2 being a global phenomena which kick-started the whole one-on-one fighting game genre. But Street Fighter 2 was not the first game in the series. That should be obvious. The answer's in the fucking name. Street Fighter 1, or just Street Fighter as it's actually known, was released in 1987, and this is the set of building blocks that would eventually create the one-on-one fighting genre that still runs today with Tekken, Mortal Kombat, Virtua Fighter and Street Fighter 6. But series creator Takashi Nishiyama actually came up with the idea of Street Fighter when he finished a game he had created before he worked at Capcom. When Nishiyama still worked for a company called IRM, he made a title called Kung Fu Master, where you'd walk along, punch dudes until you came to a boss. You beat the boss and you go to the next level. The idea of just fighting the bosses would eventually become Street Fighter. But going back to Kung Fu Master a moment, and this game was inspired by the 1978 Bruce Lee film Game of Death. And I want to talk about Game of Death just for a moment because this film is the blueprint for all of video games. It didn't just inspire Kung Fu Master, it inspired everything modern video games are about. The concept of ascending through stages, the idea of having end-of-level bosses, and bosses having a particular weak point are all ideas inspired from Game of Death. Seriously, the amount of games that have been inspired by Game of Death is unreal. Anyway, there are two other games which are also credited with being the inspiration behind Street Fighter. Yeehaw Kung Fu, which if you quickly look at it, it seems to share a lot in common. It's a one-on-one fighting game against various different characters, but the raw gameplay and mechanics of the two games are just completely different from each other. Also, Karate Champ is credited as an inspiration, which, okay, fair enough, if Nishiyama said that, then that's the case. But as far as I'm concerned, Karate Champ is utter dog shit and I don't want to talk about it. So let's move this along to Hideo Kojima's Snatcher and have a guess which of these games inspired the release of this visual novel masterpiece. That's right, Night Trap on the Sega Mega CD.
What? What the fuck?
But Snatcher came out in 1988, a full 4 years before even the Mega CD came out. So how the fuck is that even possible? Okay, well, yes, Snatcher did come out first on the MSX in 1988, but it stayed in Japan. The footage you're watching is an English fan translation, not an official release. Anyway, a few years later, Sega released the Mega CD for the 16-bit Mega Drive, and along with it, a game called Night Trap, a crappy full-motion video game where you use different CCTV feeds to capture zombie monster things. It was one of the first games to use real actors, and many of them were women being chased by monsters. By today's standards, it's tamer than a Bulgarian swimsuit model, but back in the day, it caused quite the uproar, and along with Mortal Kombat, it went down as one of the original violent video games that caused the American government to force video game packaging to carry an age rating. And remember kids, there's no such thing as bad publicity, because when the government says something is evil and a bad influence, immediately everyone wants to play that game. Konami looked at the controversy and saw dollar signs, so they wanted to make an interactive film game too. But then they looked at what was involved and how much effort it was. They said, fuck that, let's just port the 1992 PC Engine CD version of Snatcher. It's already like an interactive movie. So they did. And now if you want to buy a copy of Snatcher on the Mega CD, you'll need to sell a kidney first. A few years later, Konami also ported the game to the Sega Saturn and the Sony PlayStation, but only in Japan.
Fucking prick.
It's worth noting that most of the versions after the PC Engine release are censored in some way. The Sega Saturn version isn't, but both the Mega CD and PlayStation versions feature covered up artwork, and the Mega CD version removes any dialogue that involves looking at a woman's jugs. So for the love of God, can someone do a fan translation of the Sega Saturn version? Then we'll have the definitive release of Snatcher. I spent a bit of time talking about Snatcher because it's a good game. I was going to talk about how the precursor to Doom and the granddaddy of all FPS games, Wolfenstein 3D, was directly inspired by a 1981 game by a totally different studio called Castle Wolfenstein. That's not really that interesting, so I won't bother. Bye.
ビデオにコメントを残して、いいねボタンを押し、友達に勧めてから、ドッジケバブを購読してください。